Hi class, Mr. Scribner here. Hope you all are doing well. We're going to get started with our lesson for today. From the first slide, beginning with our warm-up, why did America's founding fathers choose to establish a federal republic? Answering that from our previous lesson. And what are the advantages or disadvantages for this government setup? All right, so you can go ahead and answer those questions. You could pause the video and answer those questions. As we go through this lesson, hopefully it will clarify, but if you don't know the answer to those questions, you can go back and look at our previous lesson. So our title slide, American Federalism, the Rise of Central Power. And so in this lesson, we're going to talk about how federalism has changed throughout American history. And you can see in that quote, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. This is from James Madison in his Federalist Paper number 45. And we can see that from the beginning, the idea of the division of power and federalism was to have a smaller central government, for many reasons, but there was this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the creation of the Constitution as to how much power should this central government have. You could also see this as evidence of why the Articles of Confederation were made so weak, because they were scared of a strong central government, which is, because central governments had been strong, it had been monarchies before this, and they were trying to avoid the same problems. You can see in the third slide, we have the government tic-tac-toe, and so you can see how it is broken down, Articles 1, 2, and 3. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches, but also you see how those are broken down by national, state, and local governments. So when we talk about federalism, we're talking about the division of power among the government within a nation. Okay, so we have a very diverse breakdown. We have three different branches of government, and we have three different levels of each of those branches of government. All right, and in slide 4 is supposed to be the video that we have attached. Because this is a PDF slide, you won't be able to watch the video through the PDF, so I want you to pause the video now and click the link to the YouTube video that we have attached and go ahead and take this time to watch that video. So as you can see, here are your vocabulary terms. You can go ahead and pause the video so you can write them down, begin to memorize them. We'll be going over them throughout the lecture, but here they are just so you can familiarize yourself with them, and you'll want to be using them in your response question at the end, the example test question that I give you. All right, so let's continue. Up there, moving on to slide number 5. We see the two different cakes of federalism, right? And you can see in the past when our country was founded from the Constitution, we have our federalism as 3 different layers, right? The authority, the different programs that are offered are divided clearly between the national, state, and local governments. All right, and you can see that today we have, as federalism has changed, as our government has changed through different circumstances, which we're going to talk about, we see the marble cake of federalism, whereas everything is mixed among the national, state, and local government. It's all intertwined. It's hard to say who's in charge of what. Is all blended. Okay, and so in the beginning, we're jumping to slide number 6. In the beginning, we have a dual federalism, and this is from 1787 to 1913. You can make many arguments of the different periods of the changes of federalism. And throughout this entire period, of course, federalism is changing. But we can see in 1913, this is the beginning of the federal income tax. And that is the point where I'm going to say that we move to our next period of federalism. All right, the 16th Amendment, where before this, There's little sharing of power. There's a very limited federal powers of the government. The founders intended that the two governments, federal and state, operate separately within the federal government, exercising only the powers delegated to it in the Constitution. And we'll see as those powers grow throughout this lecture, all right? Each government is independent and exercises its power without the assistance of other government, right? This is the layered cake that we just saw in the picture, right? There's no need for the governments to combine their powers to accomplish any purpose, okay? And the separation of powers was supposed to be so that governments would have a checks and balance, all right? Now I want to take a moment to explain why this is important, because if you turn to slide number 7, right, you can see that there's this changing federalism, the crisis of constitutional government. As the founding fathers are creating this constitutional government, there are many problems that they have to compromise about. Some people believe that slavery should have been abolished before or in the Constitution, and it wasn't. And so this is something that is ended up having to be dealt with by the federal and the state governments in the Civil War, right? But I want you guys to think about the fact that as to why this federalism is important, or why this is a better way to do things than maybe what we have going on today in our country, where there's the marble cake or the blended powers. And I want to propose a thought that in your city, you have specific needs that are different from other cities. Some cities are more agricultural or rural. Other cities, like here in Los Angeles and Santa Monica, we are more urban. And so therefore our needs and the struggles that we have, that we face, are very different than the struggles of other places, right? For here, traffic is a big problem. But in Northern California, traffic might not be as big of a problem. And so the struggles that we have are very specific to our local community. And so by having a federalism or a government that is broken down by our local governments, our city governments, we can address the problems in our city government that we have in our community, the problems that we face most often. The federal government does not understand my problems as an individual in my community. It only understands my problems as an individual, as a corporate body of the United States. And so without having the separation, the federalism, the breakdown by federal, state, and local, each one having its separate duties, we cannot have our local community or our local interests met. So looking into slide number 7, seeing how the changing of federalism, this is a struggle between the states and the federal government, right? We have the doctrine of nullification, saying that the states have the power to nullify any action of the federal government. This is showing an extra or a stronger state, or a more sovereign state, which is what the United States started as, right? And you can see the Civil War in 1861, this is one of the biggest, or the first big changes where the federal government has to increase. Of course, slavery was wrong. Of course, we needed to have this Civil War to fight for this big issue, which was that slavery was a state right, which is, essentially the Civil War was fought over slavery, of course, but slavery in the sense that the federal government was taking away one of the states' rights, right? So this was a major blow to the states' right, the nation-centered concept of federalism. Abraham Lincoln deciding for the country that slavery would be abolished, right? And Abraham Lincoln actually was very, very specific in his Emancipation Proclamation when he said that only the slaves in the Confederate States would be freed because they were enemies, and so therefore he was abiding by the Constitution. In the sense, he could not take away the states' rights of the states that were loyal to the Union, so he was using as this time of war as a way to take away the rights of an enemy country, if you will, because the South had seceded from the Union. And so I want to just look at the 13th through the 15th Amendment, the 13th Amendment being no longer would there be involuntary servitude or the abolition of slavery. The 14th Amendment says that all born or naturalized citizens, all people that are born or naturalized in the United States would be citizens, so therefore all slaves would be citizens, giving them the rights and protection under the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. All right, so we can see the Supreme Court begins to increase the federal influence, and we'll see this throughout the lecture in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. This is the beginning of the doctrine of implied powers, or if you will, powers that are necessary and proper. Okay, so implied powers, we talked about the expressed powers, right? Powers that are specifically expressed in the Constitution. And these are implied powers, powers that the Supreme Court is saying, these are implied in the Constitution that the federal government has. Also Givens versus Ogden, right? 1824, the power of Congress to influence commerce. For Congress to get involved in commerce, right? Something that would have been a state's right, now the federal government is starting to get involved in and use its power for. All right, moving on to slide 8. You can see as the 20th century progressed, right, we begin to see a overlap, or where you have what's known as cooperative federalism, right? Where now you have the state and federal government working together to do certain things. Slide 9, talking about progressivism, the early 20th century, the principles of the American founding expressed most eloquently and concisely in the Declaration of Independence were irrelevant to modern life, okay? So we start to see in this progressive period, the progressives are believing that they are in a different time period, whereas in the beginning, man was understood to be evil, and now, and government was dangerous because of evil men. Now, people are educated, people are good, right? We can solve the problems that we have in our country through government, right? We can use government to benefit society, so the government begins to get involved with the state. We start to see labor laws, right? Good things. Child labor laws, making it so that children can't be forced to work. You have environmental laws protecting our environment. The 18th Amendment, abolishing liquor, right? Looking out for people because of accidents and deaths that are happening because of liquor, right? We start to see government as a solution, and it's the end of a thought of the government as being evil or bad as it had been in the beginning in the creation of the Constitution, right? People start to believe that rights are determined by social expediency and bestowed by the government, right? These are not rights that are given to us by our Creator, but rights that are given to us by the government. Progressivism holds that government must be able to adapt to the historical circumstances. And we see this in federalism. We see as you have monopolies growing, that the federal government comes in and creates antitrust acts to break up monopolies, right, in order to protect the economy. And moving on to slide number 10, right, progressives believe that governments can solve your problems, right? This is not how it started. This is not how it began. In the preamble, we see the purposes of government, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, right? To protect the blessings of liberty. These are the purposes of the federal government in our Constitution, right? You start to see in the progressive period that there's this idea of compassion, which of course compassion is a good thing, but it starts to spread into the federal government, right? As opposed to the local government taking care of its people, we start to see the federal government being looked to provide for the people, right? Forcing generosity through government. Now the question is, should people who have more be generous with those who have less? And the answer is yes, of course. Should people who cannot take care of themselves, should they be taken care of? And the answer is yes. But the question is, who should be responsible for taking care of those people? Should it be the federal government? And I believe the founding fathers were very wise in that they said, no, the federal government shouldn't take care of them. That the state governments and the local governments, those who have a better understanding of what the needs are in the community, they should be taking care of the people, not the federal government. Because the needs of somebody in Los Angeles or in Santa Monica are very different from the needs of somebody who may be in Kansas. Also different from the needs of somebody who might be in Northern California, okay? All of our needs are different based upon our community. And so when the federal government decides that they are going to take care of people, now the federal government doesn't have an understanding of what the needs are. All right. The problem with this view is that no one knows how to get the government to do the benevolent things that they want it to do without squandering money or careless implementation of policies. Right. And so if you create a system by which the federal government can keep track of and make sure that the right and proper needs are being met, now you are wasting money by paying people to learn and understand in the federal government, people to oversee where this money is going to go. So a lot of money and jobs are being created, they're being wasted on the people to look at and find who needs the money, as opposed to the money from the local and state governments going directly to the people, that the state and local governments understand their communities, okay? And so this is very important that you understand the problem with a federal government that is large, trying to create what we know now as a welfare state. All right, so as we get into this welfare state, we see the rise of the national government to prominence, our second period of cooperative federalism from 1913 to 1964, right? We see it begins in 1913 because this is when we have a federal income tax. Before this, of course, there were state income taxes. The state government did have the power to tax. The states were sovereign. They could do as they wish. But now we have the federal income tax. This is the 16th Amendment, right? In the Great Depression, we see in the 1930s, World War II, in the 1940s, we start to see more and more power grabs by the federal government, right? And probably the biggest power grab of those two is FDR's New Deal, right? He decides that the government is now the employer, the provider, and the insurer for people. Now this is under the pretense that people deserve, or it is a right for them to have a job or to be employed, and the government is going to ensure that that happens. And so there are programs and organizations created simply to create jobs in this New Deal, right? We see the 18th and 21st Amendment, both of which have to do with alcohol. The 18th is the abolition of alcohol, and the 21st is then they rescind that abolition of alcohol. But the government is even getting involved in people's, what they're able to drink, okay? This is an example of the government stretching into people's personal lives, right? We see the rise of the national government to prominence. We see this in the civil rights movement in slide 12, right? The 14th Amendment guarantees the national government protection of its rights against state abuses, right? This is people who are born or naturalized, are citizens and are given the rights and protection of citizenship, right? And we see that in the civil rights movement that this is not happening, right? This is the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment, saying that the due process clause, the court is now telling the states what they must do. Not that these are bad things, right? Brown versus Board of Education. This is a good thing that states shouldn't be desegregated. But I want you guys to see The reason why the federal government has to overreach and the federal government has to grow is because of people that are, if you will, evil, or people that are bad. Because we see that desegregation is a good thing, right? We shouldn't be segregated based upon our color of skin. But that desegregation should have happened from within the states. It shouldn't have been the federal government telling the state that you must desegregate your schools. If the states were able to desegregate, if they had desegregated before the federal government got involved, then we wouldn't have had this overreach or this growth of federal government in the civil rights movement, okay? If the people had treated each other with equity, right? There's a difference between equality and equity. Equality is everybody is equal, right, under the law. Equity is how people treat one another. If people were good to one another, if they treated people with equity, if they were self-governing citizens, then we wouldn't have needed a Civil Rights Act, okay? But of course, we know that there is evil, that people do make mistakes, that mankind is flawed. So we see in slide 13, right? Federal grants to states. You know, when you guys apply to colleges, you'll be looking for grants as opposed to student loans, right? Student loans you have to pay back. Student grants is free money. You do not have to pay it back. And so in the same way, a grant for the state is something that the states don't have to pay back. This is money that the national government is giving the states. This money that the national government is getting from many different places, primarily from the federal income tax, all right? And so there's different types of grants that the states get. Two in particular are block grants and categorical grants. So a block grant is just money that the federal government gives to the state and allows the state to use it however it wishes. However, a categorical grant is a grant that is used for specific purposes, right? So the federal government is saying, hey, I'm going to give you this money, but you have to use it for these specific purposes. So the result is that the states are now becoming dependent upon or looking to the national government to provide their needs, right? To get a little extra money in this case. And in that light, you can see on slide 14, we see the federal grants to states and the local government. We can see the graph of how much it is increased, right? Showing that the states are becoming more dependent upon the federal government. And so moving to slide 15, we can just come back to that picture. So what kind of cake are we at now? So we are moving from what we had, which was a layered cake of federalism, our dual federalism, and now we're moving towards a marble cake of this federalism, all right? And so just to take a moment, a pause and review, all right? You take a moment on slide 16, answer the question, and then play. I will give you the answer. But the question is, of the following, which has been used most to expand the power of the national government? All right, so go ahead and answer that question, pause the video, and we will begin with the answer. All right, so hopefully you took a moment to answer that question, and hopefully you got the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So amendments, of course, those are limitations of the federal government, right? The Commerce Clause of the Constitution is giving them the federal government power to get involved in commerce, as we talked about. All right, so moving on into our third and final period of federalism is 1964 until the present. We are calling this coercive federalism, right? This is the national government directing states on policies that it must take, right? By the mid-1960s, Congress is issuing more penalties than incentives to force the states to implement federal programs, all right? These are, we're talking about unfunded mandates, right? So before, right, you would get, a state, it would say, if a state's obeyed or followed the mandate of the government, the state would get money, all right? So, but there are unfunded mandates, meaning that the federal government is forcing the states to obey this mandate and they're not even getting any money for it. For example, you have NCLB, No Child Left Behind, right? This is a reform in education. Education was an area where the federal government did not have power over, but you can see in NCLB that the federal government is overstepping, or they're stepping into a power that the state has, right? And the states, many of the states worked with the federal government. Many of them work against the federal government when the federal government gives one of these mandates, all right? And so No Child Left Behind. And we've had others since then, right? The Common Core state standards is a result of a federal education reform, okay? And you could say, well, these are good things. They are good things, but they should be things that the states are deciding for themselves, not something that the federal government should step into the state's responsibilities and powers, all right? Taking state authority. And we can see in this coercive federalism that the federal government isn't working with the states. In a sense, they're more so telling the states what the states must do. In slide 18, we see the Supreme Court and Congress mandates. The 10th Amendment says that any powers that are not given to the central government or the federal government, they are given to the states, right, or to the people, right? So that's saying that any time that Congress, right, or the federal government exceeds its delegated powers, the powers that are delegated to the federal government, that they are violating that 10th Amendment right. You can see in Garcia versus San Antonio in 1985, gave Congress almost unlimited power to reign over the states. Congress could make state governments comply with the same minimum wage and maximum hour legislation as was required for federal employees by the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is saying that in this law, in this act, the federal government stepped into the amount that a state, right, had to have as a minimum wage, saying that no state could allow its citizens to be paid under a certain minimum wage, right? This is taking something that was not power given to the federal government, and now they are taking control of it, all right? A violation of the 10th Amendment. Slide number 19, okay? You can see some more Supreme Court mandates, right? You see preemptions, right? This is where a federal law is said to supersede or override a state law, right? The Water Quality Act, right? So we're not saying that good water quality shouldn't be something that is given to American citizens. That is not what's being said. What is being said is that the water quality should be determined by the states, meaning that states should care about their citizens enough to have a high water quality standard, okay? The federal regulations apply to the states. For example, OSHA, right? This is a federal regulation of workers' health and safety, saying that the federal government is going to tell each state how their safety, the safety of their working conditions should be, right? Other expensive programs of the federal government, right? The motor voter law of 1993, okay? This is saying that every DMV should have a opportunity for people to have their voting registration, okay? American with Disabilities Act, No Child Left Behind, as I mentioned, right? The Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, right? Also known as Obamacare, right? These are all ways that the federal government has stepped in and forced the states to obey. And the question would be, if we move to slide number 20, how would you imagine the terrorist attacks in 2001? Would they cause a greater lean towards state or a greater lean towards central government? And I hope that it would seem obvious at this point that whenever there's a disaster or there's a major controversy, a conflict, a problem, an attack, a war, the federal government takes it and they overreach, or they get more involved into the state's authority. All right, slide number 21. So where are we at today? We've become a federalism, becoming a global idea, right? A top-down control. Our mindset in America is constantly growing and growing more to be a American, a federal, a national thought as opposed to a local. When you think about how are we going to deal with this problem, right? We're currently in this pandemic. How is the president going to handle the situation is what people are asking. But the reality is that federalism, the Constitution was set up to where in our communities, we would be thinking, how is our mayor going to handle this solution? Is he going to shut down businesses? How is our governor going to handle the situation? But more and more we are looking to the president to solve the problems of our nation. And if he doesn't, we put the blame on him. When in reality, it has nothing to do with the president. It has nothing to do with his responsibilities. He should be working with the governors, and then the governors working with the mayors, and the mayors, right? That is how it was set up to be. And so then as people, we would look to our mayor to show, for our guidance, okay? But the people are looking to the president to ask what should do. And if he doesn't tell us what the right thing to do is, then, we see that as a problem. We're constantly looking to the federal government to solve our problems, okay? Today, state governments are basically extensions of the national government, right? In the sense that we are looking to the federal government. So, of course, the problem with looking to the federal government, the problem with looking to the president to solve our problems is the fact that we're ignoring the sphere of influence that is most effective, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, our local, right? Our local government understands our community. It understands the needs that we have in our community here in Santa Monica. And so by understanding the needs that we have, they can most effectually govern us. But if we're looking to the federal government doesn't have any idea as to how to help. A great example would be this huge stimulus package. Each person in the United States is getting $1,200 if they make under $75,000. Now the question is, does somebody in Kansas, right, them getting $1,200, and somebody in Santa Monica, what does $1,200 mean in Kansas, and what does $1,200 mean in Santa Monica? In Santa Monica, you can't even get a studio apartment for $1,200. So that is not even a month's rent for a single person in Santa Monica, unless the person's been living here, they're elderly, and they've been living here for over 10 years, maybe even more than that. In Kansas, in the middle of a small town in Kansas, $1,200 might be 3 or 4 months rent. And my brother-in-law in California lives in Hesperia. Some of the houses there, the monthly rent is about $600. So that's 2 months rent in that community. So giving the federal government making a stimulus package for the whole country to get the same amount of money to make it fair, right? You can see how it is not effective, because somebody in Santa Monica definitely needs more money, and their local government would know that, but the federal government cannot see, and it cannot favor different communities. It cannot favor different states. It can only do the same thing for everybody across the board. Now, just as we come to a close, so this being the problem, we have this marble cake, looking at slide number 22 now. What is the solution or action steps that we can take, right? We can cut grant programs which connect the state governments to the federal government. By cutting these federal spending, right, it's reducing the arm of the federal government in the state or domestic affairs, right? Each citizen should also be a good steward of the form of government that they have, right? If we are good people and we're looking for ways to be better or more equitable to one another, right, to treat each other better, then the federal government doesn't have to step in and take control to protect the people, okay? And so the question is, as an individual, who are we looking to, as an individual yourself? Who do you look to solve your problems? Do you look to your parents? Do you look to the government, right? Do your parents look to the government? Who do you look to solve your problems, right? Are you looking to God, big G, God, or are you looking to little g government to solve your problems, to get you a job? There was a story of a young man who, during the presidential campaign, the last presidential campaign, the young man asked, hey, so how are you going to ensure that I have a job when I graduate college? It is not the president's job to ensure that every citizen has a job when they graduate college, right? For the most part, that is up to the college to create a prestige that when you graduate that college, that you will be wanted by a business, all right? That is not the president's job, but more and more, we are looking to the president to solve, we're looking to the federal government, we're looking to the government to solve our problems. And this has created a welfare state. Again, slide 23, we have the original from Federalist, paper number 45, our original quote: "The powers delegated by the proposed constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Okay? We do not want the federal government to take complete control of our government because they cannot understand the problems that we have. So just slide number 24, to check for understanding which type of government funding allows states the most discretion: categorical grants, grants in aid, matching grants, block grants, or project grants. So which one of these allows the states to decide what they want to do? And hopefully from the lecture you can answer that question. And for your test, here is a great example question. How has American federalism changed over the course of the United States, right? The Constitution, what is the Constitution's outline of federalism? How and why has it evolved? And use examples. Why is federalism more ideal than where we are going? Why is federalism more ideal than where we're going? And you can see on your last slide, you can see the homework questions. Will be requiring you, I'll put the homework questions on the Google Classroom. You can answer them and submit your answer. I hope that from this lesson, you feel like you have a clear understanding as to why federalism has changed, how federalism has changed, and why it is important that our founding fathers created a constitution with a separation of powers on our federal, state, and local levels. And why, as individuals, we should be striving to keep that separation in our own lives and in our government. Looking forward to seeing you guys again. I hope you guys are having a good break. Stay safe, stay inside, and I'll see you next lecture. Thank you.